All right. It's Friday, May 2nd, and you know what that means. I'm here with our legal analyst, Katherine Loftus, talking about a recap of the whole week this week in Karen Reed's retrial. Hi, Katherine.
Hi, Kristina. Nice to see you.
You too. I just went back and checked my notes because I honestly didn't even trust my own brain. But we have only, at this time, we record this for everybody to know during the lunch break on Fridays,
Right.
which is when the week is almost over. There's only 2 hours left. To this point, 4 days of testimony, there's only been two witnesses this week.
I was hoping we might have somebody else to talk about besides Jen McCabe, but it looks like Friday might be all of Jen McCabe.
Okay, so why don't let's go backwards. Let's start with Jen McCabe,
Yeah.
and we will go backwards to the other witness who testified at the end. So Jen McCabe has been on the stand Tuesday, Wednesday, now Friday. We had no court on Thursday. Yeah. Let's start with today. I mean, does today feel any different than the past 2 days to you?
You know, there's a little bit, I've been waiting to see if there's any change sort of in the tempo from Alan Jackson and the cross-examination of Jen McCabe. I would say that up through until today, she held her composure a little bit more. He clearly is getting under her skin. Really towards the end, she did fairly well this morning, but overall, it seems like whether it's a combination of just being questioned for this long or, there's a lot of kind of monotonous questions asking the same thing over and over in different ways. But that's all tactical to kind of, get under the witness's skin, to frustrate them so much that even if it's not on something of substance, that they're just so annoyed they're being asked the same thing repeatedly, and so then they react. So I think he finally kind of got what he was looking from her just today towards the end of the morning session.
Okay. And there is, because you're talking about the monotonous questioning and whatnot, I think there's an opportunity for you to really save a lot of our viewers and people watch this trial here, which is there's been these exchanges back and forth in Alan Jackson and Jennifer McCabe where he asks her if she remembers something and she says she doesn't remember, or it's almost like she's trying to beat him at the evidentiary game sometimes. So can you explain those interactions? Like, I think we've heard the term, does this refresh your recollection, 100 times while she's been on the stand.
That's right. So I think there's a couple of things going on. A lot of the questions have to do with, they're very specific. So when asking specific questions, now that she's been on the stand, 3, 4, this might be the fifth time at this point in various hearings, she knows that she's probably thinking in the back of her head, I don't know exactly, so I can't answer exactly, because if I do answer with an exact answer and it's not exactly right, he's going to make me look like I'm not being, consistent. But the problem is you can almost tell that she's thinking about what the answers are before answering. And that's not with every single questioning, but some of them, what they're playing a little game back and forth, Jen McCabe and Alan Jackson. When he asks her, like, what do you remember doing this at 2:27? It's not inaccurate for her to say, I don't have an independent memory of that, but she's just saying, I don't remember. Is it, and what we know now is that she has that information from subsequent hearings. So probably the better way, at least for the prosecution's case, the better way for her to have responded to a lot of things was, I don't have an independent memory of this. I have learned subsequent that there is a search at 2:27, and I take that, for what it is. But instead of doing that, she's fighting him. That gives off the air of defensiveness, which then can lead, the jury to what Alan Jackson is ultimately trying to get them to believe, is that she's being deceitful, she's dishonest, and therefore you can't take anything she says credibly.
Yeah, because there's kind of these moments. I'm thinking of some things, like there was something this morning about her getting and receiving calls from Michael Proctor in the days that followed this incident. And, she's asked if she remembers that. And she says, well, I don't remember it, but if you show me, maybe I'll remember it. He shows the record and she says, well, I still don't remember, but that's what the record says.
Right.
So I think I know the answer if I've done okay in school so far. But why does she need to remember? Why does she need to say, yes, this record makes me remember? Why is it necessary?
So what happens in court is if you want the witness to answer a certain question and they've previously, we'll use this as an example, previously been interviewed by someone and they say, I'm not really sure. I don't remember. This happens a lot with police officers who testify, who, it's 2-3 years later. And you as the lawyer know, well, there is a record of it and there is a conversation and it was memorialized in a police report. What you have to do through the rules of evidence is you have to show the witness, you have to say to them, is your memory exhausted? Yes. If I show you this piece of paper, do you think it'll refresh your memory? Yes. Let me think of it. And then you hand them the piece of paper. They read through it. Generally you advise them, lift your eyes up when you're done reading. And then you say, is your memory refreshed? If your memory is refreshed, then you can ask them, what happened or what did you tell Trooper Proctor on that day? I think it's kind of a semantics game that they're playing at this point because, I think it's fair that she may not have an actual memory of it, right? Like she probably didn't know until she was shown a piece of paper that she Googled something at 2:27. She probably just knew I Googled when I was in bed. I don't know what time it is. So technically, can she testify that she knew she Googled something at 2:27? No, but we now know she subsequently learned. So it's almost like they're doing it back and forth to each other a little bit. He's trying to catch her. She knows he's trying to catch her. And so she's being defensive in order not to be caught. But the problem is a lot of this would probably be mundane, testimony that is not going to hurt or harm hurt or help one way or the other. So she should just answer the question.
Right. And I mean, it's making her testimony 2 to 3 times as longer as it otherwise would have been, right?
Right.
The
jury, she's fighting everything.
The jury has been paying attention, but there's no doubt, like, they stopped taking notes.
Yeah.
Last several minutes. They're starting to check out. Okay, so let's go into a little bit of the substance specifically. Let's try and talk about anything new we've learned from her testimony. Especially, I think most, if anything new that we've learned has been from Cross, but correct me if I'm wrong.
You froze for a second. You there?
Reed had called her like before they were all together. Did you remember that?
I'm sorry. You froze for a second on the front end of the question.
Did you lose for a second? Hold on. I think. Sorry to pause this. If I open the door, I think it'll help.
Okay.
Because the internet is right over there.
Yeah.
Sorry to viewers. Okay, maybe that'll get better.
Yeah.
I don't remember this from the first trial. Tell me if you do. That Jen McCabe made a call to her sister, Nicole Albert, after 5 a.m., like after Karen Reed had first called her before they were ever physically together.
That's a funny, when that came up, I feel like I vaguely remember it from somewhere, but I don't know if it was in the first trial or if it was somewhere mentioned in some sort of other pretrial hearing.
Okay.
I do have a vague memory of her calling. It's interesting about all the calls because there's so many different ways you can, look at it. And ultimately that's what, Alan Jackson is trying to use all these tiny little things to catch Jen McCabe in. There's no real one big aha. This, now you can look at her and call her a liar. There's all these little, inconsistencies, and what they want you to believe based on that is not only that she's not credible, but that she was calling these people, calling Nicole at 5:07, not going into the house to get Brian or Nicole or anything like that, because they're, colluding with everybody to cover this up. The question is, does the jury make that leap? Because it's not a little leap. It's a big leap.
Right.
But he's starting to be more effective. I think he was a little Alan Jackson. I think he was a little thrown off the first 2 days because she did much better than expected. She did much better than the first time. She really didn't give in to a lot of the questions he was pushing her on. And it's difficult on cross-examination if you have a witness that you want information from, but they're not giving it to you. Yeah. You don't want to look to the jury like you're badgering them. So he's kind of been, on that line, and she's finally starting to give it back a little bit so then he can escalate it. And, that's only helpful to the defense, really.
Right. And I mean, the jury maybe could have made that leap in the final line of questioning where he was saying, did you know of any first responders on that street? Any first responders available? And she said, yes, my brother-in-law.
Right. I think, and I think it's one of these things that the jury, I'm sure Attorney Brennan will get up. I don't know if he was finished with his questioning or if Alan Jackson's continuing after.
I think he is.
Okay.
I believe that Cross is done.
So, and it depends on how long Attorney Brennan takes on redirect, but the job of redirect is now to rehabilitate the witness. So Attorney Brennan will get up, and any of these little issues that Alan Jackson was able to poke at, Attorney Brennan is going to ask them in sort of narrative form and give her an opportunity to explain them. So that's sort of the back and forth, it's like a tennis game.
Yes. One other piece of evidence today on Cross that I don't remember from the last trial, again, maybe it did happen in the last trial, was there's a group chat, which I remember, between Jennifer McCabe, her husband, Nicole Albert, and Brian Albert in the days following John O'Keefe's death. And one of the texts said, if she pleads, meaning Karen Reed, it will end. If she fights, it will be an episode. Do you remember that?
I don't remember that. No, I don't remember that happening.
What do you make of that text? This is, I think it was like 2 days after.
It's hard to look back through the lens of, as somebody in the criminal justice world. So you have somebody on that text chain that's, Brian Albert's in it. I think it's probably a fair assessment that would have been made by people, on the front end. Oh, it seems pretty open and shut. She's probably either going to plead. If she fights it, it's going to turn into a mess, that kind of thing. Can it be perceived different ways? Can it be callous and also maybe truthful in some ways? Yes. And that's why I think it's really hard when not only we have, communications that are happening sort of like in the midst of a trauma, to then come, years later and parse out every single word, every single sentence, every single communication. It's also over text, so we don't have the inflections, and it's difficult. And this is why it's ultimately questions like this. There's no one answer, right? It's not only interpreted one way. It's based on sort of the case as a whole and what the jurors think, on their own. And so ultimately it's subjective. But it's interesting. I definitely never heard that the first time.
Okay. I have 3 more topics I want to get to.
Okay.
So we've talked about this one already, but this is in prior testimony this week by Jen McCabe. We now know that at some point federal agents came to her home, and they came to her house, and she said, like, who are you? And at first she said she wasn't Jen McCabe. When they came, she thought they were selling something. Then she said, can you give me 10 minutes? And we know that in those 10 minutes, she testified that she called her husband, Peggy O'Keefe, Brian Albert, the victim witness advocate at the DA's office. And who am I missing?
Yeah.
Carrie Roberts?
Carrie Roberts.
Okay, so she called 5 people, but then the jury never gets to find out it was the Fed. They just know it was agents.
Right.
She then only told them that she had called 2 people when they asked. She doubt 3 of those people. So it's been kind of a talking point now since that she was caught having lied to the feds. Your reaction to that, and what kind of impact do you think that's going to have?
I mean, I don't think in terms of what the sort of analysis is from the outside view looking at this, I mean, it's not perjury. She's not under oath. You can't lie to, authorities. You can't impede an investigation. The problem is that she basically self-reports it, that she misrepresented it. So in terms of like any criminal liability, there is none. What weight it has to the jury, ultimately that's up to them. Do they think that this, misleading of, providing information inaccurately to these sort of unknown agents is, convincing enough to reduce her credibility? Maybe.
All right. Okay. So no, we've kind of gone through her cross. Let's just hit really quickly the demeanor shift. We've talked about this so many times now, but it just seems like a very different Jen McCabe this time around.
Yeah, she's completely different. I would not be surprised so she can't be. There's a lot of questions that I've had lately about, this idea of like coaching witnesses, prepping witnesses. And I think it's important to clarify where that will come from. That doesn't come from the Commonwealth, right? And Attorney Brennan he's aware enough of, number one, his own professional obligations and ethical obligations, but then the scrutiny on this case. So this is not Hank Brennan telling Jen, answer this way, don't answer this way, dress more casually, be softer. But I wouldn't be surprised if she had consulted with, her own private counsel. This is not, particularly someone who's going to be on the witness stand, likely for hours and hours, multiple days, under immense sort of outside pressure. It wouldn't surprise me if she had spoken with her counsel before, just about sort of guidance on how to answer questions. And I think that there's people often don't like the, I don't know, I don't recall. As an attorney, what you advise clients generally is, listen, when you get up there, tell the truth, just answer the question they're asking, don't elaborate on it. If you don't know, say you don't know, you don't recall, and then I'll get up as the, the attorney on your side, or whatever side you're testifying on behalf, and rehabilitate you. So in terms of, how different she appeared, I think she was much more casual in terms of, she looked physically better. She didn't look as stressed. She didn't look as nervous. I think she responded well to most of Jackson's questions for the first couple of days. So I think clearly she prepared, whether it was just, with her counsel or on her own. She probably, she realistically, right? Realistically, like take out, sometimes it's everything gets analyzed through these legal lens. If I'm not going to be on TV and I know everyone's going to be tearing me apart for 3 days, literally across the country, of course you're thinking about it. Of course you're thinking about how you want to appear, how you want to answer those questions. So, 100% she was prepped and ready to go. And whoever prepped her, quite frankly, did a good job.
Okay, so let's move away from cross. Let's go to direct on Jen McCabe. So a reminder to viewers, this is still the state's case at this point. So prosecution is leading. This is their witnesses right now. And you and I had spoken, and you had kind of a revelation maybe about like who Jen McCabe and who Kerry Roberts are to the state's case, why they're called so early, and who they were, or who Hank Brennan was trying to portray them as being in this situation. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. So as we talked about a little bit yesterday, I think it's not always apparent right on the front end. It's like, what is the tactic of the Commonwealth? How are they trying to present it? In what manner? And going through the witnesses over the last couple of weeks, if you really look at, the first half dozen, dozen witnesses, these are the people who I think the Commonwealth wants to frame as the ones who came to help that morning, right? So we have EMTs, paramedics, first responders, firefighters. You have even the doctor who, tested the blood at the hospital. And then you have Kerry Roberts and Jen McCabe. And what the Commonwealth is trying to say to the jury is, hey, listen, not only were these two individuals, the two women that John O'Keefe relied on the most, but when something went wrong that morning, who did Karen Reed turn to? She didn't turn to her friends. She didn't turn to John's, male friends. She turned to these two women who have been helping John, in some ways raise his niece and nephew. So I think the Commonwealth it was smart to present it that way, because what it does is it makes the attack on them a little bit harder. What you have to then believe as the jury is, okay, these women who were so deeply involved in John's life, are they capable, or at least one of them, Jen McCabe, capable of, covering up his murder and then colluding with all these people and the police officers? So it was smart of him, Brennan, I think, to frame them in that sort of vein, because I think it sets the standard of who John was, who the people he chose to surround himself with. And then the question for the jury would be, are those the people that ultimately harmed him, or does that not make sense?
Okay, the final topic I want to get to is becoming a tale as old as time with this case, the 227 Google search. To catch anybody up, there's a phone extraction from Jen McCabe's phone, and it shows 27 a.m. Google search for some version of How Long to Die in Cold. This is the reason that timestamp would matter, is because this would be hours before John's body was discovered. However, the Commonwealth has an expert who testified earlier this week that timestamp is erroneous, and that this search actually happened at 6:23 in the morning. And he even did like a live demonstration for jurors to show them the process by which you can make Google searches on your phone and how the timestamp can be wrong. So this is just like a tale of two, did it happen or did it not? What's your takeaway, and what's your takeaway on the expert testimony about this?
So I thought that overwhelmingly Ian Whiffen presented as a very qualified expert. I think he, both on direct examination and cross-examination, I mean, there was some points in which Attorney Alessi was able to get him to concede to, but I don't think that changed his overall opinion. And the interesting thing is, this is ultimately, I think it's important for people to recognize that experts ultimately give opinions, right? They're not fact. They shouldn't really be taken as fact. What you're doing is saying, okay, this is outside both the attorneys and the jury, this is outside the scope of our knowledge. And so we're going to bring people in who have a base of knowledge to explain this a little bit better. And what often happens with experts is you either have them on the same sort of level, kind of same background, experience when they testify, even if they testify to two different things, one for the defense, one for the Commonwealth, you can see that both are fairly persuasive. Other times you have sort of uneven expert witnesses. So think like Trooper Paul testifying for the Commonwealth versus Aka, very different. So I think the concern for the defense with the expert witness is that Ian Whiffen came off very credibly, both in his review, his report, and then the live demonstration says the 227 Google search did not happen. It happened at 6:23 and 24, which is allegedly when Karen Reed asked Jen McCabe. Now, the defense is going to have Richard Green testify, who testified in the first trial. The problem with Richard Green is, despite his opinion that it's at 227, we know now that he actually reached out to Ian Whiffen and Celebrate as the experts because he didn't know how to correctly interpret it. And then, when he didn't hear back before that. So, that feels like an imbalance, right? We have two experts, one of who was asking the other experts really, opinion in order to help to form their own opinion. So it again, everything comes down to, it's very, it's a he said, she said kind of case, right? Do you believe this expert or do you believe the expert? Overwhelmingly, I think Ian Whiffen came on very credibly, and we'll only be able to see what happens when Richard Green testifies, if he'll be able to rebut that, successfully.
Do you have any crystal ball predictions? Who's coming next generally?
So I was thinking about that this morning. I would bet that the next is maybe someone in the first responder field again, maybe just one more to sort of tie in, remind, so the Commonwealth called a couple of first responders on the front end, and then they have civilian witnesses. So that gives sort of a more personal feel to it. And now that some of that testimony has been contested through Jen McCabe, likely the best way to rehabilitate it is to call an impartial third-party responder. So maybe somebody like Anthony Flamati, who testified pretty well, under direct and cross on the first time. He allegedly heard her make some statements. So I think, in terms of how you want to buttress, each witness should really kind of work off the next. Yeah. So that's what I would guess, but I could be wrong.
All right, we'll see. Well, thank you as always. I'm sorry that gave us trouble at times, but I appreciate it.
Thank you. I hope you have a nice weekend.
Bye.
Bye.